Jim's address today is titled, Celebrating Sally Hemings, Taking Back the Narrative of America's Unacknowledged First Lady. Please welcome James to the podium.
Thank you, Bart. I should add that 30 years ago when Bart introduced me, I was dressed head to toe in period costume, and I did the address of the life and times of Thomas Jefferson in the first person. So you get an idea of what a nerd I am as far as history goes. Wait a minute, quick change. No. As you can imagine, to do something like that, I read all sorts of history books, and I came across one that was just out. It was by a black woman scholar by the name Annette Gordon Reed. And unlike what I will, for lack of a better word, call white history, she gave the history as written by the black descendants, correspondence, facts and figures that from their interpretation, because obviously white history as we know it, call it establishment history, whatever you want to call it, it was very political, especially from the Civil War on. It was all about excusing, explaining, and defending white privilege, or more, well, not only white, but male privilege, and the ownership of slaves. Well, I was fascinated, and I incorporated a lot of her early discussions about Sally Hemings, because in her mind, this was a person who engaged with Jefferson on a relatively equal measure. But there wasn't really proof, per se. So I didn't go all in at that time, 30 years ago, as far as talking about Sally. I basically soft-pedaled the reality of it. And I felt a little bad about that at that time. And don't you know, 6 months later, I see that Annette Gordon Reed is going to be speaking at the Scarsdale Library. So I go. And aside from promoting the book she had written, she talked about how coming up very shortly were going to be DNA tests of the actual heirs. And, you know, and she said, when that comes out, I am going to have another book, because there's scads of things now coming in because I wrote the first book. Well, absolutely, about a year and a half later, I started seeing news that the DNA actually was quite positive. These were definitely Hemings and Jefferson's children. And sure enough, Annette Gordon Reed wrote then her opus, which was The Hemings of Monticello, An American Family, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. And now you can't get her at a library for free. You're going to have me for free. And I will give you 90% of what I have to say today is directly based on what Gordon Reed wrote. And then another 10% comes out of some more current things, including archaeological work at Monticello and so forth. So without further ado, I will give you Sally's history just as it is. I have to warn you that it may not be what you expect, may not be what you would like to have had happen. It's just going to be real. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to bring it forward for me personally and perhaps ethically for all of us. But you have to begin with the actual history. And without further ado, taking back the narrative of America's unacknowledged First Lady. To understand Sally and her milieu, the times she lived in, you got to start with her grandmother, Parthenia. Torn from her family in West Africa, probably 13 or 14 years old, driven to the shore, put on a slave boat, ends up in Virginia, sold to one Francis Epps. a wealthy Virginia planter. In the course of doing her duties, whatever that might be, somehow or other, she crosses paths with a British sea captain by the name of Robert Hemings. Sparks fly, a child is born. Now that's not very unusual, frankly. What came later, though, is Hemings goes to Francis Epps and he says, "You have my daughter. You cannot own her. She's mine. I want Parthenia and the daughter, I want a family." Francis Epps say, "What, are you insane?" He grabs his horsewhip. You can imagine, Hemings leaves. A month later he comes back thinking, okay, I'm going to do it his way. I want to buy them. I want to buy mother and child, have a family. Again, the horsewhip, and he runs for his life. He finds out that later that Epps dies. He goes to the widow Epps and says, "Please," he begs, "let me buy them." And she is of no mind to hear of it. But two things come out of this. The widow Epps is so concerned that this madman is going to abscond with them in the middle of the night that she brings Parthenia and the daughter Betty into the house to work as a maid there because she wants to protect her possessions. And because of his ardor, if you will, about this family idea, Betty has a name. It's Hemings. It is a name which means that she is legitimate. It's a name that means she is wanted. And for the Hemings family, this is incredibly important, having a name to be proud of. So that's Betty, and she's growing up in this house. Now, Sally's future father, interesting chap by the name of John Wales, grows up poor in a rural area of England called Leicester. His illiterate coal mining grandfather raises him because his father dies. And the grandpa saves every little pence he can and puts the boy through school. He thrives, comes to the attention of a wealthy planter on business in England. He makes him his servant. They go back to Virginia. He's got a facility for numbers and law. Soon he's brokering every sort of deal you can imagine. Slaves, rum, tobacco, anything on credit, he's there. Takes a little piece of every action, grows rich. But what he really wants is respectability. Takes a look around, sees the widow Epps, maybe a little past her prime, but lots of land and lots of slaves. They marry. 2 years later, they have a daughter, Martha Wales. The widow Epps dies. A very common thing in childbirth then. Well, Wales looks about. Now Betty Hemings is 13. He sees her. She's a bright, competent person in the house. Hands her the baby. You raise her. I have business to do. And indeed he did. He went off, married another woman, had 4 more children. That woman dies with the 4th baby. And then he goes out and finds another wife. But before they can even have a baby, she dies. So now he's 46. He's buried 3 wives. He has every material possession. But he doesn't have any happiness. He looks about, sees Betty Hemings, now 26, a vibrant woman, who is running his entire house. She has 4 children of her own. She's raising his 4 white children, plus Martha, who's now 13. And the house is very happy. He thinks to himself, what am I missing here? Why don't I get involved in this? So sure enough, he makes her an offer to be his concubine, which, by the way, was a legal term at that time for that which, a wife which cannot be by law. And of course, as you probably all know, marriage between the races was a crime. I mean, even marriage between blacks was not even recognized in law. There was no such thing in law. But she thinks it over and thinks, this is actually great. So they begin a relationship. 12 years, 6 children. The last of which is Sally Hemings. Now, to get to where we get to Jefferson, I have to backtrack a little. Martha Wales, when this all begins, she's 13. You might wonder, what did she think about this? She hated having stepmothers, right? They were mean, they were cruel, the whole deal, just like in the fairy tales. While Betty Hemings truly raised her. All things considered, Betty Hemings was, for all intents and purposes, her mother. So Martha was actually thrilled. No more, mother-in-laws and all that stuff. The woman that had raised her was now actually her, so to speak, mother. It was great. So life went on, and Martha grows up. At 18, she gets married to a guy named Skelton. They go off, have their first child. Child dies. 6 months later, Skelton dies. So at the ripe age of 20, Martha returns to the home a widow. Wales, in his business travels, knows of a up-and-coming lawyer, brings him to the house. He sees Martha. Before you know it, she's Mrs. Thomas Jefferson. Now, their life starts pretty well. They go off to a modest home. Betty sends her 2 eldest children to help them set up their home, live with them. And they have a child named Patsy. And at this point, Sally is born about 9 months later. So they are very, very close in age. I should mention, though, at this point, when Sally is born, instead of the mother dying, Wales dies. In those days, everything that had been owned by the Epps family went to Martha. So all the land, all the slaves, including all the Hemings, they were, after all, possessions. So Jefferson goes about having a big house built, the first Monticello, and everybody piles into this. They create little cottages on Mulberry Row for those who can't fit in the house. And it seems to work out pretty well. He thrives. He becomes a colonial governor. He goes when he has Sally at this point now is in the house, of course, and she's being raised right in between Patsy and their second daughter, Polly. They're essentially in the same carriage, if you will. Little aside here. So y'all know about the Declaration of Independence, right? Jefferson's in Philadelphia at this colonial convention. He's told to draft the Declaration of Independence. He takes with him 12-year-old Robert Hemings, which is the eldest of the Wales Hemings children, as his manservant, all right? And at night, he promises Betty that he'll keep the boy up on his studies. And at night, Robert would have to straighten up the room, and Jefferson would have him take what he had written that day and read it aloud, both for his studies and so that Jefferson could hear what the words would sound like. So it's entirely possible that the first person to read the Declaration of Independence was Robert Hemings. So they go along, and then Martha gets pregnant. She's going to have her third child. She does have Lucy, but her health gives out. She never recovers. About 6 months of dying. Sally is 9 years old. Her task during this is to have her bed next to Martha and to care for her at night when she can't do anything. And this is in both black and white history that this was a very moving moment at her death. Aside from one of the last things she did was to take the little 9-year-old Sally and to take the bell that she would use then to, let her know that she was in distress. She put it in her hand and closed it over and perhaps passed away right then. We don't know precisely, but the other thing that came out of this was that Martha and in her mind, her history of these awful mother-in-laws asked him to promise that he would never remarry, and he said he wouldn't. Well, the revolution is pretty much over at this point. The British surrender to Washington. Washington sends Jefferson to Paris to be our representative there. Jefferson takes the next in-line brother, James Hemings, with him, because James is interested in becoming a chef. So they go there. He's doing his diplomatic duties. He pays for James to become trained as a French chef. And that life is going on pretty well. There's reason to believe that James begins a gay love affair with the valet, Adrian Petit. And everything would be smooth except that he gets a letter that his youngest daughter, Lucy, has just died. So he freaks out, Jefferson does a bit, because he's imagining here this little girl, Polly, that he's left behind. He barely knows her. So he asks that she be sent to him in Paris. Well, that's a bit of a to-do. They expect to take one of the Hemings, an older daughter named Isabel, to go with Polly overseas. But just before they leave, turns out she's pregnant. So now they say, who are we going to send? Who are we going to send? Polly's in tears saying, the only thing I can do is go with Sally. She's, her bosom buddy. And everybody shrugs and say, well, I guess it'll have to be that way. So this 14-year-old Sally and 11-year-old Polly get on a boat and go to England first and then to France and finally to Paris to join up with Jefferson and with James. So, as you can imagine, Paris at this time, very interesting place. The revolution there is afoot. Jefferson has been there by this time 3.5 years. He has toured the continent. He's had a love affair with a married countess. He's just living the life, right? He is a lionized person. I mean, he's a writer and whatever. People love him. So he's not expecting this young girl to have come with his daughter. He was expecting a much older woman. And he had plans on how to take that woman back, that she would just go on the boat. But it was totally impractical to send a 14-year-old. So now he sends his two daughters, so they get to know each other better, to a school in a convent. And Sally is his to figure out what to do with. He thinks to himself, I'm going to send her back. This is crazy. I have got nothing for you to do here. I'll figure out some way to send you back. Sally begs, no. I'm here with James. I want to experience France. And she convinces him, she understands his mentality pretty well. She convinces him that she's learned to sew, that if she were to get training, she could become a seamstress and make fancy clothes like they have in France and bring them to Virginia. And of course, Jefferson, being this kind of person who wants to see everybody, become something, she knows exactly how to get him. And so, sure enough, he says, okay, you stay, and you'll end up getting trained. But first, you have to be inoculated. Smallpox was a killer in those days, and she had come over. He had asked somebody to have whoever sent to be smallpox inoculated, but she, at the last minute, the change, she had not been. So he pays for this very expensive inoculation, which includes something like 4 weeks in a quarantine, and then another 4 weeks in bed rest. So by the time she's back, and this 4 weeks, James is spending a lot of time helping her, but Jefferson does take some turns to sit there, and he knows that she wants to learn French, so they end up starting to talk in French. It's really the first time he's actually gotten to know this person, because after all, she was a little kid when he left. And it's undoubtedly what strikes him is the similarity to his departed wife. You know, here's another side. So much of our history, things like the birth of the nation and minstrel shows and even well-meaning things like Gone with the Wind or Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's this enormous effort to make blacks and whites seem like they were really different and they talk different, all this stuff. And that historical analysis has found that this is just utter garbage. People, and common sense would tell you this is true, people in similarly situated circumstances will talk the same. So if you were a poor, itinerant, subsistent farmer, white farmer, you would talk very similarly to a slave in the field. What we call a southern accent, they would have the same version thereof. Likewise, if you were an upper crust planter and you had, and we'll now narrow it down to just Sally, say, someone who has lived in your home her entire life, her mother has been her entire life in a home like this, naturally, they would speak similarly. On top of that, she is, of course, Martha's half-sister. So genetically, there's a whole host of similarities. The process of how they become lovers, you know, we have lots of stuff in fiction and history that, well, I would call it the whore or Madonna syndrome. Women in history, they've got to be one or the other. That's the only solution, right? If she was a Madonna figure, well, he must have forced her. And if she was a whore, well, she made him. The truth is, much simpler, they just simply grew close together. And Sally's granddaughter wrote in a letter that Jefferson simply fell in love with Sally. It's not that hard to understand. 16-year-olds in that era regularly got married. If you were 18, you were already, suspect in age. So that part is hardly unusual. And the fact that he was 30 years older, frankly, that was not even that unusual. I can give you a gazillion examples of much bigger age gaps. But be that as it may, they were happy. Now, like I say, the revolution is really picking up. They have to put extra police out front because people are starting to throw bottles and this and that. And at this time, James and Sally are talking. I should go back to mention that there's no slavery allowed in France. So all this time, they've been getting paid. James is getting paid as the chef de cuisine, actually a quite good salary, better than most comparable chefs. And Sally is getting paid as a seamstress. And they are pooling their money. They have it in their mind. We're staying here. This is cool. We like this. We're going to take our chances. Freedom sounds good. And they're planning this. And then, like I say, the revolution is starting to get a little dicey. The whole idea of staying there would be presumably to work in a wealthy person's home as a maid and a chef, right? They're starting to wonder about that. And in amongst all this, then the love affair begins. And to top it all off, she becomes pregnant. Now they really have to figure things out because in a month, that boat's going back to America. They got to figure out who's on it. Well, James doesn't want to go. Sally is unsure. She realizes that while as attractive as freedom is, it would essentially mean giving up her family back in Virginia. which is not so bad perhaps for a male, perhaps a male who doesn't fit in sexually to the norms, but for her, it's pretty dicey. So Jefferson figures out how to combine freedom and family. He says, if you come back with me, we will live as man and wife in our house. We will not break the law. We won't get married. But I will make you the promise that you will be the woman of the house. You'll have complete control. And all of our children will be freed once they become 21. You know, it's her choice. She figured it out. She decided. She had agency, as they say in the modern world. She figured out, you know, I could stay here and who knows what'll happen. I know what'll happen if I go there, back to Virginia. All of it, of course, depended upon her trust and faith in his word. I can tell you that 38 years later, everything that he promised came to pass, and that, in fact, they lived 38 years of I won't call it a marriage like we think of, but certainly they were completely tied together on their themes and how to live and how to protect their private life, how to protect their family life. So I'm going to go into a bit more of that. Before I do, I should say they come back to Virginia, and I'd love to have a happy little story here, but the first baby dies. Jefferson is in New York, where the first seat of government was. He's now serving as Secretary of State. And he has these knockdown, drag-out battles with Hamilton. He hardly can even get home, let alone have more kids. So James is with him. And here's another aside. Okay. How many of you know Hamilton, right? The play, right? In it, there's this song, I want to be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. So this, in history, is Jefferson's modest little home, 22 Maiden Street in Manhattan, lower Manhattan. What happens in the room where it happens is that the Southerners, Madison and Jefferson, and Hamilton representing the other side, so to speak, they make a deal to swap influence, that the Southerners will get the Capitol built in Virginia, and Hamilton will get to create money through treasury bills. It is really, ultimately, the founding of our real country, so to speak. Money and power in a location. And in history, it's always talked about that there's three people, and only three people in the room where it happens. But no, there's a fourth person. James Hemings cooks the meal, serves the meal, 6-course, mind you, serves the wine between each course, tells dirty jokes in French, and otherwise is the host for this marvelous little thing in history. So at this time, I forgot something. I wanted to tell you something. When they come back from Paris, this is another big, talk about white history, here we go. When they come back, and this is in all the books, everywhere, it's Christmas Eve, 89. They arrive at the base of the mountain, Monticello, and all the hundreds of slaves are there to greet them. And it's huzzahs and huzzahs, and they take the horses away from the carriage, they pick up the carriage, and they charge up the hill. So in white history, this is all about how the black people love Jefferson, and they love being slaves, and oh my God, we can't live without you. But of course, that's not really what it's about. The letters from James and from Sally have arrived in advance. They know that she is pregnant, that they have made a deal, that essentially the kinship that they already have is now grown so much tighter that it essentially, and you got to understand how insecure the life of a slave was. This would essentially be guaranteeing security, at least, for the foreseeable future. It was an enormous light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. So the joy that they were showing made perfectly good sense when it's applied to Sally and her situation then with Jefferson. And I should mention, of course, Jefferson was esteemed and all that. It's not like they didn't like him, but the reality is they loved Sally. So, they end up having children. First, a daughter is born. She dies at 2 years old. Finally, a son is born named Beverly. And at this point, Jefferson is now Adams' vice president. And the nature of things, as much as they would like to keep private and public life apart, rumors start to fly. Nobody's named, but things are going on at Monticello, that sort of thing. And it culminates when he's actually elected to president. 2 years into his term, a guy named Callender, James Callender, a sort of a drudge of his day, prints that, in fact, Jefferson has a black harem, and that all these disparaging things. Now, you might think that Jefferson would do something about this, but he had learned. I'll tell you what he had learned. That very first day when he came back from Paris, that was Christmas Eve. The very next day, he goes to meet with a person who he'd never even met before, a guy named Thomas Bell. Why did he meet him? Thomas Bell was a shopkeeper in Charlottesville, which is a 10-minute carriage ride from Monticello. Thomas Bell had arranged to pay for Mary, that was the eldest daughter of Betty, to live with him. But it wasn't just living with him. He considered her his authentic wife. Their children, he gave them his name, and in the future they would inherit and all this sort of thing. And Jefferson and he talked about how to negotiate, how to navigate the world. And Bell's view was, as long as he had this deed for slaves, for Mary as a slave, Virginia law couldn't touch him. He could do anything he wanted, including treat her as an equal. And so he did. Oddly enough, he was able to pull this off. So Jefferson had this template in his mind. When these scandals began and people began to write up, he knew that as long as Sally and he kept the veneer of slavery, and as long as they didn't poke the establishment in the eye with the idea that they were married, they didn't ask for a marriage license, as long as they did that, they were unassailable. So Jefferson and Sally decided that the course of action is silence. We won't write about it. We won't talk about it. All the correspondence, anything that Sally had ever written, was destroyed. There is no letter existing where Jefferson writes about Sally Hemings in any way. The only notation in his handwriting is in his farm book, where he simply puts her name and the children as they're born. This was a very concerted effort. And on Sally's part, let's imagine what she's going through. At this point, she has 2 children, a second Harriet, who was named after the first that died, and Beverly. And people are coming around, poking around, looking in the window, that kind of thing. They are going to Robert. Robert is free now and living in Richmond. They're going to James, who is free and living in Philadelphia. And they're trying to get truth out of him, you know. But Sally has, she's made it clear to all of her relatives that there will never be discussion of this. This is not to be, don't sell me out, right? And that discipline is maintained. Well, Jefferson, the scandals die down because he doesn't feed it. And ultimately, he retires. They rebuild Monticello into a much bigger house, very grand. All the Hemings are involved. And they structure the house just to take care of their private life. And if you maybe saw, like within the last year, there was an archaeological find of Sally Hemings' room. And if you Google it, this is how history works. If you Google it, one of the things that'll be said in there is, it's a windowless room. Like this is a dungeon or something, right? Think about it through. They constructed the house in such a way that Jefferson's private quarters were on the second floor. There's a back staircase to this room, this parlor. The only way to get to the master bedroom was through her room. The only other way was the main entrance, which was always locked. The only people with the key was Jefferson and Sally's cousin, Burwell Colbert, who was for 30 years, the butler. So they literally structured a life where there were public rooms, and believe me, they use those public, the guest list at this home is unbelievable, and a private domain. Now, they had two more children, two more boys, Madison and Eston. Excuse me, Eston. If you want to get a picture of what they were really like, here's a little tidbit. All three boys learned to play the violin. Jefferson was the only person on the mountain who knew how to play the violin. You don't learn the violin by accident. The windowless parlor was their place to be a family, to hang out, play the violin, and to play with the kids. And all those people roaming around in the gardens trying to get a look at everything and see how they lived. No, they couldn't see. It was rather ingenious. I'm going to go forward into the latter stages of their life. It was, as I mentioned, Jefferson had freed a couple of the most important people to him, Robert and James Hemings. And he kept his promise. When Harriet and Beverly, the two eldest, came of age, Sally and he put them on a stagecoach with some money, a destination all pre-planned, and to satisfy the law, he put down that they ran away, but of course they went off to a new life. And this is a bit bittersweet, I got to tell you. They went off and became white. And not only that, but they had to change their name. This idea of family and freedom, it's rather ironic that what she fought for was of having family ended up being where those two passed, and that's sort of an ironic word because to the rest of the Hemings, they essentially were dead. They never corresponded. After about 2 years, they were completely gone. Even to this day, we have no ability to trace them in history. The other two, along with all the people who they had interned under to become carpenters and to be metal workers and so forth, Jefferson, at his death in 1823, he freed 5 people. The two Hemings sons and the three other people that were the main people, like Burwell, in his household. Sally, for obvious reasons, he did not want any kind of record of her. Legacy is like an asset. To Jefferson, his legacy, it was not, and even the fact that he was ready to die, he was all about living in the future with his legacy. So, not to mention that in Virginia law, if he freed her, he would have to actually write to the state senate to get the freedom to do that. He was able to do that with the sons and allow them to live in Virginia, but if he did it for her, anybody who was put up like that could be debated. Didn't want that. So, when the sons were freed and they went to live in Charlottesville, she just went with them. Nobody said boo, because that's just the way it is. She was in charge. Now, Sally lived 9 more years in Charlottesville, 2 doors down from her sister Mary and her children, the Bells. And it's interesting to me that, I suppose like all of you, about a year or whatever ago, these marches, Unite the Right in Charlottesville, they were very disturbing to me, I'm sure to everybody. And I wondered to myself, when I was watching it, I'm going to summate here by saying, what is the value of history? These people, Unite the Right type, they're overlooking Charlottesville is the University of Virginia that Jefferson created in his very last years. There's a marvelous rotunda with his statue looking out on the town of Charlottesville. These folks at that march with their tiki torches and all that, they're running around his statue. We will not be replaced. Did they have any clue whatsoever the real life of Jefferson? And I thought to myself, because I was watching, and being a history nerd, on all this stuff that I knew, I thought to me, how ironic. After all, Jefferson's statue is looking 1 mile away at Sally's grave. And they're marching through between them with not a clue as to what they're really saying or what their hero was all about. They only have their view. And I thought to myself, how do you change that? You can't fight hate with hate. You have to give it an alternative. You have to present, a love alternative. I would like to think that the spirit of Jefferson and Sally, perhaps represented by the statue and the grave, they're looking upon each other. I would like to think that their love could be a message to these folks, and that the silence that they employed to be able to get through life, I would like to think that their spirits would say that now is the time for that silence to be broken. I would like to think that now is the time for Sally Hemings to be an acknowledged First Lady. Thank you.